Good evening. This is Fear NOX. Tonight you will hear the kind of stories surface crews do not share unless they trust you. Divers, tenders, instructors, and night shift operators. People trained to stay calm, follow checklists, and never raise their voice, trying to explain the exact moment the water changed around them. These accounts come from steady hands and practiced breaths. Voices cutting out mid-sentence, lines going slack when they should be tight, and final words that do not match the scene recovered minutes later. Nothing dramatic, just that slow, sinking realization that something below them had already made its move. Subscribe and hit the bell. If you have ever waited on a voice to come back on the radio, this one is for you. All right, let us get into it. I was the lead diver on a night survey, assessing the structural integrity of a submerged quarry wall. The air above the water was sharp with a late autumn chill, and a thin fog clung to the surface. A faint, intermittent static had begun to intrude on the comms channel just as we started the descent. The quarry lake was a deep, dark cut into the Appalachian bedrock, fed by underground springs. Its waters were notoriously cold, even in warmer months, and visibility could shift without warning. Our task was to document a section of the old quarry face, specifically a series of ledges and a suspected room at a considerable depth. The surface team, consisting of 2 tenders and a comms operator, monitored my progress from a small, temporary cabin set up near the water's edge. Headlights from our vehicles cut through the night, illuminating the immediate work area. The hum of the generator provided a steady background drone to the quiet night. The gravel underfoot crunched with every movement. Our standard procedure involved a full face mask with integrated comms, a primary tether line, and a secondary safety line. I carried a depth log and a small, waterproof recorder to capture observations. The surface team maintained a detailed logbook, noting depth, time, and any communications. This was a routine operation for our team, though night dives always added an extra layer of caution. We had surveyed dozens of these old quarry sites across the region, mapping their submerged features for various engineering projects. The isolation of these locations was typical, often requiring a drive down a narrow, winding trail off the main highway. The forest pressed in close around the water, amplifying the sense of being cut off from the world. I entered the water just after midnight. The initial plunge was a shock of cold, even through the dry suit. I began my controlled descent, following the guideline. The surface lights quickly faded into a diffuse glow above me. The water temperature dropped noticeably at about 30 feet, a distinct thermocline marking the boundary between the surface layer and the deeper, colder water. My breathing was steady, a muffled sound inside the full face mask. I reported my depth and conditions to the surface team every few minutes. The static on the comms channel persisted, a low, crackling whisper beneath the voices. It was not severe enough to warrant an abort, but it was a constant, irritating presence. At a depth of about 100 feet, I reached the first ledge. The rock face was rough, covered in a thin layer of fine silt. My powerful dive light cut through the gloom, revealing the ancient tool marks on the stone. I began my visual survey, documenting the features as I moved along the wall. The water was remarkably clear at this depth, a stark contrast to the murkier surface layers. I reported the clarity and the stable conditions. The comms operator acknowledged my transmission, their voice slightly distorted by the persistent static. I continued my descent, following the wall downwards. The target room was located deeper, at approximately 180 feet. I had studied the sonar scans, which indicated a large, irregular opening. As I approached the estimated depth, the water temperature dropped again. feeling barely above freezing. I could feel the cold seeping through the layers of my suit. My light beam swept across the dark rock, and then I saw it. A wide, dark aperture in the quarry wall. It was larger than the sonar had suggested, a gaping maw in the stone. I reported the discovery, confirming the presence of the room. The comms operator instructed me to proceed with caution, reminding me of the silt risk. I carefully entered the opening, pulling myself along the rock face. The room was vast, its ceiling lost in the darkness above my light. The floor was covered in a thick layer of fine silt, undisturbed for decades. I moved slowly, trying not to stir the sediment. The air inside my mask felt heavy, and the sound of my own breathing was amplified by the enclosed space. I began to describe the dimensions of the room, my voice calm and measured. The static on the comms channel seemed to intensify slightly, making the surface team's responses harder to discern. I repeated my observations, ensuring they were logged. As I moved deeper into the room, my light caught a large, submerged beam, likely part of an old support structure, spanning across the room about 10 feet above the floor. It was encrusted with mineral deposits, but still solid. I reported its presence, noting its position relative to the entrance. I planned to pass under it to explore the far side of the room. Just as I was about to move, I noticed a subtle shift in the water around me. A faint, almost imperceptible cloudiness began to form near the floor. It was the first sign of a silt disturbance. I immediately reported it, stating that the water was beginning to brown. The comms operator acknowledged, instructing me to maintain my position and assess the rate of siltation. I held still, my light fixed on the growing cloud. It was rising faster than I had anticipated, a dark, opaque curtain spreading upwards from the floor. Within seconds, the visibility began to deteriorate rapidly. My powerful light beam struggled to penetrate the thickening cloud. The outlines of the room's features blurred, then vanished. I could no longer see the rock face, the beam above me, or even my own hands. I was enveloped in an absolute, impenetrable blackness. The calm static flared, a harsh, grinding sound that momentarily drowned out the surface team's voice. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my tether line. It was the surface team, signaling me to return. I acknowledged the pull, my hand reaching for the line to begin my ascent. The silt was now so dense that it felt like swimming through thick mud. I could feel the fine particles against my dry suit, a gritty texture. My comms crackled again, and I heard a fragmented question from the surface. I knew I needed to respond, to confirm my status. I took a breath, the muffled sound loud in my ears. I managed to utter a single, clipped word into the microphone. Beam. It was meant to convey that my tether was caught or rubbing against the submerged structure I had just reported. Then, the comms went silent. The static vanished, replaced by an unnerving, absolute quiet. The tether line, which had been taut a moment before, suddenly went slack. On the surface, the comms operator had heard my final transmission. The word beam was recorded, clear despite the preceding static. Then, silence. The tenders immediately began to pull the tether line, expecting resistance, expecting my ascent. Instead, the line came up with an unexpected ease. It felt light, almost empty. They continued to pull, their movements precise and practiced. The line emerged from the water, dripping and dark. It was slack, with no tension from a diver on the other end. As they brought it in further, they saw the abrasion. The tether had been chafed, not severed, but severely worn over a sharp edge. The damage was consistent with it having been pulled across the submerged beam I had reported. The surface team immediately initiated emergency protocols. They attempted to re-establish comms, broadcasting my call sign repeatedly into the silent water. There was no response. The logbook was updated with the exact time of the last transmission and the observation of the slack line. The generator hummed, the headlights cut through the fog, but the scene felt suddenly cold and desolate. The isolation of the quarry intensified. The team leader made the call to local authorities, reporting a diver in distress. The dispatch operator took the details, their voice calm and professional over the radio. Rescue divers were mobilized, arriving at the quarry site a few hours later. The night had grown colder, and a thin layer of frost had begun to form on the equipment. The initial recovery efforts were hampered by the extreme siltation within the ledge room. The water there remained an opaque, impenetrable brown. Specialized sonar equipment was deployed, attempting to locate any anomaly within the room. The scans showed the general outline of the space, but no distinct target that could be identified as a diver. The recovery team faced immense challenges. The cold, the depth, and the zero visibility made every movement a risk. The surface team provided all available evidence: the dive profile printout, the logbook entries, and the audio recording of my final word. Photographs were taken of the damaged tether line, documenting the abrasion marks. The investigation was thorough, procedural. The recovery efforts continued for several days, extending into a week. Each day brought the same result: nothing. The silt in the room eventually settled, but the area remained eerily empty. The local authorities filed a comprehensive report, detailing every step of the incident and the subsequent search. The file was eventually closed, citing an unrecoverable loss. The official report concluded that the rapid silt-out, combined with the tether snagging on the submerged beam, led to an incapacitating event. The exact nature of that event remained unknown. The cold, the depth, the sudden loss of visibility. These were all contributing factors. The incident was a stark reminder of the inherent risks in deep quarry diving. I still hear it sometimes: the low, crackling static on the comms channel, the muffled sound of my own breathing, and that final, clipped word, echoing in the absolute silence that followed. I was the dive instructor, overseeing a night checkout for a student. It was a late autumn night, cold and clear, at the old quarry lake. The student's first radio check came back with a faint, unusual hum beneath his voice. The quarry lake was a deep, dark basin carved into the Appalachian foothills. Its steep, rocky sides dropped quickly to a silty bottom, reaching depths of over 100 feet in places. This particular section, a former CCC reservoir, was known for its clear surface water, but also for its sudden, sharp thermoclines. We used a small, unheated cabin near the water's edge as our base, its single generator humming softly, casting a weak light across the gravel path. Tonight, the air was barely above freezing, and a thin frost had already begun to form on the exposed rocks. The isolation of the place was absolute once the sun went down, with only the distant sound of a highway barely audible through the dense forest. Our night dive procedures were always meticulous. We double-checked every piece of equipment, from the primary console gauge to the full face mask. Communication protocols were rehearsed, and depth limits were clearly established. The student, a man named Mark, was competent in open water, but new to the specific challenges of night diving. This was his final checkout, a solo descent under my direct radio supervision. My surface setup included a powerful radio, a backup light, and a detailed logbook for recording every transmission and observation. The hum I heard earlier on his initial radio check was a minor anomaly. easily dismissed as interference from the generator or a slight frequency drift. I made a note of it on my slate, a small detail in an otherwise routine preparation. Mark entered the water just after 9 o'clock. The surface was calm, reflecting the few stars visible through the crisp night air. His initial reports were clear and concise. He confirmed his depth, his air pressure, and the visibility, which he described as surprisingly good for the first 20 feet. I logged each report, watching the faint glow of his dive light descend into the black water. The radio crackled with the sound of his breathing, a steady, rhythmic intake and exhalation that indicated calm and control. He reported passing the first thermocline at about 30 feet, noting the sudden drop in temperature. His voice remained strong, unaffected. I could hear the faint bubbling of his exhaust, a constant presence on the radio channel. He continued his descent, following the pre-planned profile. His console gauge showed a steady rate of drop. At around 60 feet, he reported reaching the first ledge, a wide, flat shelf of rock. He spent a few minutes there, practicing buoyancy control and shining his light into the deeper water. The hum on the radio had faded, or perhaps I had simply grown accustomed to it. The night air grew colder around me, and I pulled my jacket tighter, watching the dark surface of the lake. Mark's voice came through again, reporting his intention to descend to the next depth, a target of around 90 feet. This was where the second, more pronounced thermocline was expected. As he approached 75 feet, his voice changed. It became noticeably thinner, as if he were speaking from a greater distance. He reported a sudden, intense cold. His words were slightly slurred, and there was a new, distinct crackle of static underlying his transmission. I asked him to repeat his depth and temperature. He responded, his voice now sounding strained, describing his arms as feeling heavy, almost numb. He mentioned a strange pressure, not on his ears, but across his chest. The bubbling sound of his regulator, which had been so clear, now seemed muffled, distant. I checked my own gauges, confirming the radio was set correctly, the antenna clear. The static grew louder, a persistent hiss that threatened to overwhelm his words. He reported his depth as 80 feet, and the temperature is barely above freezing. He repeated that his arms felt heavy, like lead. I instructed him to begin a slow ascent, to come back up to the warmer water. There was a pause, a long moment filled only with the hiss and a faint, distorted gurgle. Then, his voice returned, a mere whisper now, almost lost in the noise. He said he was trying to move, but it was difficult. The words were fragmented, broken by bursts of static. I could no longer discern the rhythm of his breathing. The console gauge on my surface unit, however, showed his depth holding steady at around 85 feet. It did not indicate an ascent. I called his name, my voice firm, trying to cut through the interference. There was no clear response, only a rising tide of static, punctuated by what sounded like a faint, struggling gasp. The bubbling sound was gone entirely. The depth profile remained stubbornly fixed at 85 feet. I continued to call, my hand hovering over the emergency alarm button. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the relentless hiss of the radio. The small dive light, which had been a steady beacon, flickered once, then vanished completely into the blackness below. The cold air felt sharper, and a sudden dense fog began to roll in from the forest, obscuring the lake surface. My immediate response was to initiate emergency protocols. I pressed the alarm, a piercing siren that echoed across the quarry. I grabbed the spare full face mask and my own console gauge, preparing for an immediate entry. I continued to call Mark's name on the radio, switching frequencies, trying every channel. There was only the dead static. I knew the risks of entering alone, but the situation demanded it. I pulled on my dry suit, my hands moving automatically despite the rising dread. The generator hummed, a constant, indifferent sound in the growing silence. I contacted local authorities on the satellite phone, the call connecting slowly through the remote Appalachian terrain. I explained the situation, the sudden loss of communication, the students' last reports. The dispatch operator sounded calm, but I could hear the underlying urgency in her voice. It would take time for a team to reach us. The gravel road leading to the quarry was long and winding, barely more than a trail in places. I provided the exact coordinates, though I knew they were already on file. The fog was thickening now, reducing visibility to just a few feet. While waiting, I reviewed my slate notes, comparing them to the recorded comms. The temperature profile data confirmed a severe thermocline at around 80 feet, a drop of nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of a few feet. This was consistent with Mark's reports of extreme cold. The recording of his last transmission was chilling. The thin, distant voice, the heavy arms, the struggle, and then the overwhelming static. There was no indication of a rapid ascent or descent on my surface gauge. It simply held steady, then flatlined. About an hour later, the first set of headlights cut through the fog, bouncing along the trail. It was a local search and rescue team, followed by a small medical unit. They set up powerful floodlights, illuminating the eerie, fog-shrouded lake. The hum of their equipment joined the generator. We reviewed the evidence, my logbook, the dive computer data from Mark's last recorded dive, and the radio recordings. The team prepared for a recovery dive, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The fog was now so dense it felt like a physical presence, and the temperature continued to drop. The recovery dive commenced just before midnight. 2 experienced divers entered the water, equipped with powerful lights and specialized sonar. The cold was intense, even for them. They reported zero visibility below about 40 feet due to the silt and the darkness. After nearly an hour, they surfaced, reporting no visual contact with Mark. They had swept the area around 85 feet where his depth gauge had last registered, but found nothing. The bottom was a soft, featureless silt, easily disturbed. They did, however, recover his console gauge, which had somehow detached from his BCD. Its display showed a final depth of 87 feet and a water temperature of barely above freezing. There was no sign of his full face mask, his tank, or his body. The search continued for several days, expanding beyond the quarry lake into the surrounding forest. Local authorities combed the area, but found no trace. The official report concluded with apparent dissociation due to extreme cold shock combined with compromised communication. There was no equipment malfunction found on the recovered console gauge. No medical preconditions were identified. The file was eventually closed, the case remaining an unsolved disappearance. The quarry lake, once a training ground, became a place of quiet dread. The incident left a profound mark. I still review the logbook sometimes, looking at the precise entries, the recorded depths and temperatures. I still hear the static, the faint, struggling whisper, and the sudden, absolute silence. The cold of that night, the isolation of the forest, it all remains. I was a lead diver on a geological survey team. It was late autumn, the air cold, and the lake surface still. Our sonar had shown an anomaly along the quarry wall. My partner and I were tasked with mapping the submerged features of a deep quarry lake, nestled in a region of steep ridges and dense forest. The lake was known for its extreme depths and clear, cold water, a common characteristic of these man-made reservoirs. Our initial sonar sweeps had indicated a significant vertical drop-off along one particular wall, a sheer face that plunged hundreds of feet. What caught our attention was a faint, irregular echo about 200 feet down, suggesting a recess or a void that did not appear on any existing charts. We planned a series of dives to investigate this specific area. The first dive was a daytime recon, a standard procedure to assess visibility and general conditions before a more detailed night survey. We felt a subtle, consistent pull against our bodies as we approached the target depth, a gentle current that was entirely unexpected in such a still body of water. Our work followed a strict protocol designed for safety and precision in challenging environments. Each dive began with a thorough equipment check, ensuring our full-face communication systems were clear, our rebreathers functioning, and our dive lights charged. We meticulously logged our gas mixtures, planned bottom times, and ascent profiles. The surface team, stationed in a small cabin near the shore, maintained constant radio contact, monitoring our depth, gas consumption, and heart rates. They also managed our primary guideline, a robust rope secured to a surface anchor, which we would follow down to the target area. The quarry lake was a familiar environment, but its depths always demanded respect. The water temperature dropped significantly below the thermocline, becoming barely above freezing, and ambient light faded quickly, even during the day. Our logbook entries detailed every parameter, every observation, every minor deviation from the plan. This methodical approach was our safeguard against the inherent risks of deep water exploration. The incident began during our second dive, a planned night operation to get a clearer view of the sonar anomaly. We descended along the guideline, the beam of my primary light cutting a narrow path through the deepening blue. The surface lights became distant pinpricks, then vanished entirely. The cold pressed in as we passed the first thermocline, a distinct layer where the water temperature dropped sharply. Our comms were clear at first, the steady hum of the surface pump a faint background noise. As we approached the 200-foot mark, the subtle current we had felt earlier became more pronounced. It was a steady, persistent tug, pulling us gently but firmly along the vertical rock face. My partner, Mark, signaled a question on his slate, asking if I felt it. I confirmed with a nod and a hand signal, indicating the direction of the flow. We continued our descent, maintaining our position relative to the wall. The current seemed to originate from a point along the rock, but there was no visible opening, no crack or fissure large enough to account for the flow. The rock face was smooth, almost polished in places, a dark, featureless expanse under our lights. I checked my depth gauge and temperature sensor. Both readings were stable, consistent with our dive plan. The current, however, was not. It felt like a slow, deliberate pull, not a turbulent surge. We decided to follow the current's path, moving cautiously along the wall, our lights sweeping the dark stone. The comms began to crackle with static, a low, intermittent hiss that made Mark's voice sound distant and muffled. I adjusted my comms unit, but the static persisted, a new and unwelcome element in the deep silence. Suddenly, without warning, a cloud of fine silt erupted from the wall directly ahead of us. It wasn't a small puff. It was a dense, expanding bloom that instantly swallowed our lights. Visibility dropped to 0. One moment, I could see the rock face. The next, I was in a complete blackout, surrounded by a thick, particulate fog. The current seemed to intensify slightly, pushing us into the swirling cloud. I reached out, trying to maintain contact with the wall, but my hand met only the soft, particulate water. My comms crackled again, and Mark's voice was a garbled whisper, almost lost in the static. I could hear a note of urgency, but the words were indistinguishable. I tried to respond, but my own voice felt swallowed by the interference. I felt for the guideline, our lifeline back to the surface. My hand closed around it, and I began to pull myself along, trying to orient myself. That's when I felt it. The line was not smooth. There were turns, loops, and what felt like deliberate knots tied into the rope. These were not the simple markers we used, nor were they accidental snags. They were complex, interlocking patterns, almost like a series of figure eights, spaced irregularly along the line. I knew for certain neither Mark nor I had tied these. We had checked the line meticulously before the dive. The surface team would never have allowed such knots. The realization sent a cold jolt through me, colder than the surrounding water. The current continued to tug, pulling me deeper into the silt cloud, away from where I thought Mark should be. The static on my comms became almost constant, a harsh, grating sound that made communication impossible. I could hear Mark's breathing, ragged and fast, but no clear words. The strange knots on the guideline continued, each one feeling deliberate, almost like a trail of breadcrumbs leading us further into the unknown. I tried to untie one of the knots, but it was tight, almost fused by the pressure and cold. My fingers, encased in thick gloves, struggled with the unfamiliar pattern. The current, now noticeably stronger, began to pull me with more force, dragging me along the wall. I could feel the rough texture of the rock scraping against my tank as I was pulled sideways. This was no longer a gentle tug. It was a persistent, directional force. I signaled Mark to abort the dive, hoping he could see my light through the silt, or at least feel the vibration of my hand signals on the line. There was no immediate response. The surface team, through the garbled comms, began to ask for our status. Their voices were strained, barely audible through the static and the hum of the distant pump. They reported unusual depth readings from our transponders, indicating we were moving erratically, not following our planned ascent profile. The disorientation in the silt was profound. I couldn't tell up from down without relying entirely on my instruments. The cold felt sharper, more invasive, as if the water itself was pressing in with intent. I focused on the guideline, my only tangible connection to the surface, and began to pull myself upward against the current. As I ascended, the strange knots continued to appear on the line. Each one was a stark piece of evidence that something was profoundly wrong. They were spaced at irregular intervals, some tight against each other, others separated by several feet of smooth rope. It was as if someone or something had been actively manipulating our guideline while we were down there. The silt cloud slowly began to thin as I gained altitude, but the current remained, pushing me slightly off the vertical. I could just make out the faint glow of Mark's light above me, a small, wavering beacon in the murk. His breathing was still audible, still fast, but the static had lessened slightly. He was also ascending, following the same compromised guideline. The surface team continued to call, their voices now clearer, demanding an immediate return to the surface. We broke the surface a few minutes later, gasping for the cold night air. The surface team was already there, their headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in over the lake. They helped us out of the water, their faces etched with concern. Our comms logs showed significant periods of static and garbled transmissions. Our depth profile showed erratic movements, consistent with being pulled by an unknown current. The guideline was immediately examined. The strange knots were still there, undeniable and inexplicable. They were complex, almost decorative in their intricacy, certainly not the result of a simple snag or entanglement. There was no logical explanation for their presence. Our official report detailed the unexpected current. the sudden silt bloom, and the inexplicable knots on the guideline. The dive site was immediately closed for further investigation. Subsequent sonar sweeps and ROV deployments found no inlet, no fissure, no geological feature that could account for the steady inflow we had experienced. The water samples showed no unusual particulate matter or temperature anomalies. The incident was filed as an unexplained environmental event, a rare occurrence in an otherwise predictable environment. My partner and I were debriefed extensively, but we had no answers beyond our observations. I still think about that current sometimes, the steady, deliberate pull along the dark wall. I remember the feel of those knots on the line, the way they seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The silence of the deep water, broken only by the static and the distant hum of the pump, still echoes in my mind. I was preparing for a deep night dive, a routine check of the old quarry floor. The air was sharp with late autumn cold, a thin frost already forming on the dock planks. A faint static hummed on the radio, a sound I rarely heard in this particular Appalachian cove. My role involved mapping the submerged structures of the abandoned quarry. This included the old rail lines that once transported stone from the pit. The work was precise, requiring careful navigation in near-total darkness, relying on a tether and a surface team. We had a new section of track to survey, a bottom run that descended into a deeper, colder thermocline. The water temperature was barely above freezing at depth. I had completed hundreds of these dives over the years, each one logged meticulously. The surface team, Mark and Sarah, were experienced and reliable. We had a clear protocol for every contingency. The radio static was minor, but it was a deviation from the expected silence. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible whisper in the background. I made a mental note of it, but did not voice it. Our standard procedure for a night dive involved a comprehensive equipment check, a detailed dive plan briefing, and a final radio check. I would descend along a weighted line, tethered to the surface, maintaining constant communication. My depth gauge and bottom timer were primary instruments. Mark monitored my air consumption and depth readings from the surface console. Sarah managed the tether, ensuring it remained free of snags. The quarry lake was deep, its walls dropping sharply to a flat, silt-covered floor. Visibility was often limited, especially below the first thermocline, where the water turned to an inky blackness. The rail lines were a primary feature of the quarry floor. They were mostly intact, a series of submerged metal tracks disappearing into the murk. We had a rough map, but the goal was to create a precise digital model. The work was slow, methodical, and required absolute focus. The cold was always a factor, even in a dry suit. The isolation of the deep water was profound, broken only by the muffled sound of my own breathing and the occasional crackle of the radio. We had never encountered any significant issues on these dives, only the expected challenges of a dark, cold environment. I entered the water just after midnight, the surface illuminated by our work lights. The initial descent was smooth, the cold biting at my exposed face before the dry suit sealed me off. I passed through the first thermocline, feeling the sudden drop in temperature. The visibility diminished rapidly, the light from my headlamp struggling against the particulate-laden water. I reached the bottom of the main shaft, a depth of about 100 feet, and began my traverse along the known rail line. The metal tracks were cold and slick under my gloved hand. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, revealing the rusted sleepers and rails. I moved slowly, methodically, deploying markers and taking readings. The tether paid out smoothly from the surface. I could hear Mark's calm voice occasionally on the radio, confirming my depth and air pressure. The static was still present, a low background hum, but it was not interfering with communication. I reached the end of the previously mapped section and began to follow the tracks into uncharted territory. The rail line descended gradually, following the contours of the quarry floor. The water grew colder with each foot of descent. I could feel the chill radiating through my suit, a constant presence. The silt on the bottom was fine, easily disturbed, and I moved with extreme caution to avoid a blackout. The rail line here was less distinct, partially buried in sediment. I was focused on the task, my attention entirely on the track ahead. I reported my depth, a little over 150 feet, and continued to move forward. The tether remained taut, a constant connection to the surface. Then, the line went slack. It was not a sudden jerk, but a gradual easing of tension. I paused, my hand still on the rail. This was unusual. The tether should have maintained a steady pull. I waited, listening for Mark's voice, but heard only the low hum of static and the sound of my own breathing. I tried to pull the line, but it felt loose, as if there was too much slack. I reported the issue to the surface. There was a brief pause, then Mark's voice, slightly distorted by the static, confirmed they were checking the reel. A few moments later, the line became taut again, but it felt different. There was a subtle vibration, a faint tremor running through the rope. I continued my survey, moving along the rail line for another few minutes. My depth gauge read a little over 170 feet. I reported this to the surface. Mark acknowledged, but his voice sounded strained. The static on the radio seemed to intensify slightly, a crackle now accompanying the hum. I felt a slight tug on the tether, a gentle pull that seemed to come from below me, not from the surface. I stopped again, shining my light around. The rail line continued into the darkness. I could see nothing out of the ordinary. I checked my depth gauge once more. It still read a little over 170 feet. I reported the strange tug. Mark's response was delayed. Then he said they were experiencing some resistance on the reel. He asked me to confirm my depth again. I did. He then asked me to hold position. The tether felt oddly heavy now, a dead weight pulling downwards. I could feel a faint metallic clank, a sound that seemed to resonate through the water, coming from somewhere below the rail line. It was a single, sharp sound, then silence. I remained motionless, my light sweeping the immediate area. The metallic clank had been distinct, not a natural sound of the quarry. The tether was now completely slack again, draped across the rail line. I tried to pull it, but it felt jammed, unmoving. I reported the situation. Mark's voice came back, urgent now, telling me they could not retrieve the line. He said it was completely stuck. The static on the radio was louder, making his words difficult to discern. I could hear Sarah's voice in the background, a low murmur of concern. I tried to follow the tether with my light, but it disappeared into the silt and darkness below the rail line. It was clearly caught on something. My primary concern was the integrity of the line. I knew the railbed was uneven in places, with discarded equipment and rockfalls. I attempted to free the line by pulling it from different angles, but it remained stubbornly fixed. The cold was becoming more pronounced, seeping into my bones despite the dry suit. The isolation of the deep water felt absolute. Mark instructed me to cut the tether if I could not free it. This was a last resort, a break in our primary safety protocol. I reached for my cutting tool, but hesitated. The thought of being untethered in that depth, in that darkness, was unsettling. I decided to try one more time to locate the snag. I carefully moved off the rail line, descending slightly into the silt, following the taut tether downwards. The visibility was almost zero now, my light beam swallowed by the stirred sediment. I felt along the line, my gloved fingers searching for the obstruction. The tether led me deeper, past the rail line, into a narrow crevice between two large, submerged rocks. My hand brushed against something cold and hard. It was metal, a thick, rusted plate. The tether was wedged tightly underneath it. I tried to pry it loose, but it was immovable. The plate felt like part of a larger structure, something heavy and deeply embedded in the quarry floor. I reported my findings, describing the metal plate and the jammed tether. Mark's voice was clearer now, the static having momentarily lessened. He asked me to confirm my depth again. I looked at my gauge. It read a little over 170 feet. There was a long silence from the surface. Then Mark spoke, his voice low and strained. He said their console was reading a depth of over 200 feet. He repeated it, slowly. Over 200 feet. My depth gauge was clearly showing a different reading. I checked it again. 170 feet. I reported the discrepancy. The radio went silent for a moment. Then Sarah's voice came on, her tone tight with concern. She asked me to ascend slowly, cutting the tether if necessary. The depth mismatch was a serious problem. I felt a cold dread settle over me. My gauge was calibrated, checked before every dive. The surface console was also reliable. One of them was wrong, and the implications were profound. I cut the tether, feeling the sudden, unnerving freedom in the darkness. I began my slow ascent, relying on my own instruments, leaving the jammed line behind. I surfaced a little while later, cold and shaken. Mark and Sarah were waiting, their faces grim in the beam of the headlights. My depth gauge was immediately checked against their console. The discrepancy was undeniable. My gauge read a maximum depth of 172 feet. Their logbook showed a maximum depth of 208 feet at the point of the tether jam. The difference was significant, almost 40 feet. A full report was filed. The dive was officially logged as an equipment malfunction, though the exact cause of the depth gauge discrepancy was never definitively determined. The tether was eventually recovered a few days later by a remotely operated vehicle. The retrieval report confirmed it was indeed jammed under a large rusted metal plate, part of an old ore cart frame. The location of the snag, according to the ROV's instruments, was consistently recorded at a depth of 209 feet. The evidence was clear, but the initial readings remained a mystery. The incident was closed, the file marked. I continued diving, but never in that particular quarry again. The memory of that metallic clank, and the feeling of the tether pulling downwards when my gauge read a shallower depth, stayed with me. I still hear that faint radio static sometimes, a whisper in the quiet of the night, reminding me of the cold, dark places beneath the surface. I was a municipal contract diver, tasked with routine inspections and maintenance. My work often took me to the older reservoirs, deep under the Appalachian ridges. This particular night was cold, the air barely above freezing, and the water promised to be colder still. My assignment was a sweep of the primary outlet gate at the Blackwood Reservoir. The structure was an old concrete and steel design, dating back to the Civilian Conservation Corps era. It was late autumn, and the surrounding forest was mostly bare, a skeletal silhouette against the faint glow of the distant town. The surface team had set up a small generator, its hum a steady background to the quiet lapping of the water against the shore. I checked my full face mask, the comms system, and the integrity of my tether. The night air held a crisp, metallic scent, typical of these high-elevation lakes. My routine was always the same, a practiced sequence of checks and double checks. I reviewed the intake diagram one last time, noting the dimensions and potential snag points. The surface team, 2 experienced tenders, monitored my air supply and communications. We had worked together for years, a silent understanding passing between us. The water temperature log showed a surface reading of about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with a predicted thermocline drop further down. I adjusted my dry suit, ensuring a tight seal against the cold. My dive slate, secured to my wrist, held the specific instructions for the gate inspection. I entered the water slowly, the cold seeping through the dry suit's outer layers before the thermal undergarments took hold. The initial shock was always present, a sharp intake of breath. The surface lights cast a limited glow, quickly absorbed by the dark water. I gave the "okay" signal to the tenders, then began my descent. The tether paid out smoothly, a lifeline connecting me to the world above. The mask hiss was a constant, reassuring sound, the rhythm of my own breathing. As I went deeper, the ambient light faded completely, replaced by the beam of my primary lamp. The water grew colder with each foot of descent. I passed through the thermocline, a sudden, distinct drop in temperature that felt like entering a different liquid. Visibility was already poor, a murky green-black that swallowed light. At about 60 feet, the silt began to thicken, stirred by the faint currents near the outlet. My lamp beam became less effective, scattering off the suspended particles. I reached the gate structure, a massive concrete wall that felt immense and silent in the dark. I signaled my arrival to the surface team, a brief, clear transmission. My task was to sweep the gate, checking for debris accumulation or structural anomalies. I moved slowly, methodically, running my gloved hand along the cold, rough concrete. The water here was still, almost unnaturally so, despite the immense pressure. The only sounds were my own breathing and the faint hum of the tether cable, transmitting vibrations from the surface generator. I worked my way across the gate, marking my progress on the slate. The silt was a constant challenge, clouding my vision whenever I disturbed it. I relied heavily on touch, feeling for any irregularities. Then, I felt it. A low vibration, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from within the concrete itself. It wasn't the cable hum, which was higher pitched and more consistent. This was lower, a guttural thrumming that resonated through my bones. I paused, pressing my helmet against the gate, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant engine running far below the earth. It was a murmur, a deep, featureless rumble that seemed to fill the water around me. I reported it to the surface team. "I'm picking up a low-frequency vibration," I said, my voice calm, modulated by the comms. "It feels like it's coming from the gate structure itself, or perhaps deeper." There was a brief pause from the surface, then a query about the nature of the sound. I tried to describe it more precisely. "It's a steady rumble, not mechanical, not like a pump, more like a deep, sustained note. It's under the water, not on the surface." I moved my hand along the concrete again, feeling the subtle tremor. The sound intensified slightly, a barely perceptible increase in its low thrum. It wasn't loud, but it felt pervasive, a pressure in my ears. I continued my sweep, trying to dismiss it as some resonance from the reservoir's internal workings, perhaps a distant water flow through an unseen pipe. But the gate was closed, sealed. There should have been no significant flow here. The water remained still, the silt undisturbed except by my movements. The cold seemed to deepen, a sharp, penetrating chill that went beyond the dry suit's protection. I reached the far side of the gate, completing the initial sweep. The rumble was still present, a constant, unsettling companion. "Sweep complete on the primary face," I transmitted. "The rumble is still here. It's very low, almost a infrasound. It feels like it's coming from beneath the gate, deep in the bedrock." I paused, listening. The sound seemed to pulse, a slow, deliberate beat. It's a very strange sensation. The water is completely still, but this sound is it's like a deep, quiet murmur, almost like My transmission cut off. Not abruptly, but it faded, replaced by a steady, featureless static. The mask hiss was still there, my breathing still regular, but the comms channel was dead. I tried to transmit again, pressing the button on my helmet. Nothing. Just the white noise, a constant, soft roar in my ears. The rumble from the gate was still present, perhaps even clearer now without the surface team's voices. It felt closer, more immediate. The isolation was absolute. On the surface, the tenders immediately recognized the comms failure. They had heard my last words, the trailing off of my sentence. The radio filled with static, a sound they knew too well. They began the emergency retrieval protocol, reeling in the tether slowly, carefully. They tried to hail me repeatedly, their voices crackling through the static, but I heard nothing. The generator hummed, the headlights cut through the night fog, illuminating the small work area. One tender checked the comms unit, tapping the console, but the static persisted. The retrieval was slow, deliberate. The tether was my only connection, my only way back. I felt the gentle tug, indicating they were pulling me up. The rumble from the gate remained, a constant, low thrumming against my helmet. It didn't change, didn't intensify, but its persistence was unnerving. The cold was a dull ache now, a pervasive sensation that seemed to seep into my core. I kept my lamp focused on the tether, watching it ascend into the murky darkness above. The silt continued to obscure my vision, a swirling cloud around me. As I ascended, the water temperature gradually increased, a subtle shift that signaled my approach to the thermocline. The static in my comms remained, a steady, featureless roar. I could feel the pressure lessening, the weight of the water slowly lifting. The rumble from below the gate began to fade, becoming less distinct, absorbed by the increasing distance. It was a gradual diminishment, not a sudden cessation. I continued to monitor my air, ensuring a steady, calm breathing pattern. Panic was not an option. Finally, I broke the surface. The night air felt sharp against my face, a stark contrast to the cold water. The tenders were there immediately, pulling me onto the small platform. They helped me remove my helmet, their faces etched with concern. The first thing I heard was the frantic chatter of the radio, still spitting static. I could hear their voices, but they were distorted, barely intelligible. My ears rang with the silence that followed the removal of the helmet, a temporary deafness after the constant mask hiss and static. I reported everything immediately, my voice steady despite the lingering chill. The low rumble, the comms failure, the feeling of isolation. The tenders confirmed they had lost my signal after my last partial transmission. They had recorded the entire incident, the audio log capturing the static that replaced my voice. We reviewed the dive report, noting the depth and duration of the comms blackout. The city work order was updated with the incident details. There was no explanation for the comms failure, no obvious equipment malfunction. Later, the audio recording was analyzed. The low-frequency rumble I described was present, a faint, almost subliminal sound beneath my voice. It was consistent, a steady, deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the water itself. After my transmission cut off, the static was pure, featureless, devoid of any other sound. The operations memo noted the unexplained audio anomaly and the comms failure, recommending further investigation. No subsequent dives were scheduled for that specific gate for some time. I still think about that sound, that quiet murmur under the still water. It was a presence, unseen and unheard by anyone else in that moment. The cold, the dark, the isolation, they all contributed to the feeling. But the sound itself was something else, something that lingered. I still hear it sometimes, a deep, quiet thrumming, just at the edge of hearing. It comes back to me in the quiet moments, a subtle resonance from the deep. I was the lead diver that night, preparing for a routine survey of the old quarry lake. The air was sharp with the late autumn chill, barely above freezing, and a thin fog clung to the water's surface. Our radio checks, usually crisp and clear, carried a faint, persistent hum from the moment we powered them on. My partner, Mark, adjusted his mask, his breath pluming white in the beam of my headlamp. We were tasked with mapping a specific section of the reservoir, a narrow forest cove known for its steep drop-offs and deep silt beds. The surface team, just 2 people, stood by our entry point, their own headlamps cutting through the mist. The hum on the comms was not severe, but it was unusual for this equipment. It was a low, steady sound, a kind of background static that seemed to whisper just beneath the voices. We noted it in the logbook before our final gear check. The water looked still and black, reflecting the distant headlights of a passing vehicle on the highway above the ridge. This familiar environment felt different that night, colder than the temperature alone suggested. We had performed many dives here, but the hum introduced an unfamiliar tension. We dismissed it as a minor electrical anomaly, a common occurrence, and proceeded with our plan. The cold seeped into our dry suits even before we entered the water, a promise of the depths we were about to explore. Our dives were always methodical, following strict protocols. We specialized in deep water recovery and survey work in these Appalachian quarry lakes and CCC reservoirs. The terrain was always challenging, with submerged trees and sudden dramatic changes in depth. Mark and I had been a buddy pair for several years, our movements underwater almost synchronous. We relied on a shared reel for navigation and safety, always keeping a hand on the line. Our radios were our lifeline to the surface and to each other, especially in low visibility. We carried dive slates for communication, though voice comms were preferred. The water temperature dropped significantly with depth, often creating distinct thermoclines that felt like invisible walls. Below a certain point, sunlight never penetrated, and our powerful lights were the only source of illumination. The bottom of these lakes was often covered in a fine, suffocating silt, easily disturbed into a complete blackout. We understood the risks and respected the environment. Every piece of equipment was checked and rechecked, every dive plan meticulously reviewed. This was our job, and we took it seriously. The isolation of these deep, cold waters was a constant factor, demanding absolute focus and trust in our partner. Our training covered all contingencies, from equipment failure to sudden currents. The surface team maintained a detailed logbook, recording our depth, time, and air consumption. They were our eyes and ears above, ready to respond. This professional system had served us well. We descended slowly, our lights cutting through the murky water. The initial thermocline hit us at about 20 feet, a sudden drop in temperature. The hum persisted. Mark was just to my left, his light beam occasionally crossing mine. We followed the contour of the submerged ridge, deploying our shared reel. The line paid out smoothly, a tactile connection to our planned route. Visibility was fair for the first 100 feet, then began to degrade as we approached the silt shelf. This was the area we needed to map, a wide, flat expanse of fine sediment at the base of the ridge. I signaled to Mark, indicating we would slow our pace. The water grew colder, thermoclines pressing. The silt shelf appeared as a gradual darkening below us, a clouding that absorbed our light. We reached the edge, the fine particles swirling gently with our movements. I felt the silt's texture on my gloved hands as I steadied. Mark was still beside me, his light a steady beacon. We began our search pattern, moving slowly across the shelf, maintaining visual contact. The radio hum seemed to intensify slightly here. I checked my depth gauge. We were at about 150 feet. The temperature chart on my slate showed the water was barely above freezing. We continued for what felt like several minutes, our lights methodically sweeping the featureless bottom. Silt was easily disturbed, creating brief blackouts. I heard Mark's breathing over the radio, a steady, rhythmic sound. Then, a slight change in the water current pushed me gently to the right. I adjusted my buoyancy, turning back towards Mark. His light was no longer visible. I swept my own beam across the area, but saw only swirling silt. "Mark?" I called over the radio, my voice calm and measured. The hum was still there. No immediate response. I waited a few seconds, my light still searching. The shared reel line felt taut, but I could not see its end where it should have connected to Mark. I pulled gently on the line, expecting a tug. Nothing. The line felt strangely slack, as if simply trailing. "Mark, do you copy?" I repeated, a slight edge now in my voice. Still only the hum. My breathing sounded loud. The cold penetrated deeper. I began to circle slowly, expanding my search pattern, keeping one hand on the reel line. The silt was thickening, stirred by my movements. I was careful not to cause a complete blackout. My light beam was swallowed by particulate matter. I felt a growing sense of unease. This was not a normal loss of contact. I checked my air gauge, then my depth. Still at 150 feet. I tried to recall the exact moment I lost sight of him. It had been quick, a momentary shift in current, then he was gone. I activated my emergency beacon, a standard procedure. The signal would reach the surface team. I continued to search, my light sweeping in wide arcs through the gloom. The hum became the only sound. Mark's breathing was gone, replaced by the drone and my regulator. I pulled on the reel line again, harder this time. It still felt slack. I began to reel it in, slowly, carefully. The line came in without resistance. It felt too light. After a few feet, I felt a sudden, sharp tug. I stopped, holding the line. "Mark?" I whispered into the radio. The hum seemed to pulse. I pulled again, and the line came in freely once more. Then, a few more feet, another tug. It was intermittent, not the continuous resistance of a diver. It felt like the line was snagged, then coming free. I continued to reel, my heart rate picking up. The cold was a physical presence, a pressure on my chest. The line finally came to an end. It was severed, a clean break. The end was simply gone. I stared at the clean cut, illuminated by my light. This was impossible. Our lines were strong, designed for tension. A clean break suggested immense force or deliberation. I called the surface team, my voice tight. "Surface, this is Diver 1. Lost visual and line contact with Diver 2. Emergency beacon activated. Line appears severed. The surface team responded immediately, their voices crackling through the hum. Copy, Diver 1. Ascend slowly. Maintain comms. We are initiating emergency procedures. I began my ascent, slowly, carefully, my eyes still scanning the blackness below. The hum was constant, an unsettling companion. I kept calling Mark's name, but received no reply. Only the hum. The water grew slightly warmer as I ascended, but the cold dread remained. I was alone in the deep, and my partner was simply gone. My ascent was a blur of procedural steps. I maintained my safety stops, my mind racing, but my body moving on instinct. The surface team was waiting, their faces grim in the glow of their headlamps. I broke the surface, shedding my mask, and immediately reported the details. The severed line, the sudden disappearance, the lack of any response from Mark. The hum was still present, even out of the water, permeating the night air. The surface team immediately initiated the emergency action plan. One person contacted the local sheriff's department and state police dive team. The other reviewed surface logbook entries and radio transmission recordings. They confirmed that after my initial call, only my voice had been recorded on the comms channel. Mark's last transmission had been a routine air check, about a minute before I lost visual contact. There was no distress signal, no sudden gasp, just silence after his last check. The hum, however, was clearly audible throughout the entire recording, a constant, low drone beneath our voices. Within an hour, first responders arrived. Headlights cut through the forest, illuminating the narrow trail. Gravel crunched as more vehicles arrived. The state police dive team was mobilized, and a full search and recovery operation began. The area was secured, a perimeter established. I provided my statement, detailing every movement, every observation, every sound. I described the silt shelf, the thermoclines, the specific location where I last saw Mark. I drew a sketch of our planned search pattern. The dive team prepared for their own descent. They used specialized sonar equipment to scan the area, hoping to locate Mark or any sign of his equipment. The water was still and black, reflecting emergency lights. The air grew colder as night deepened, a heavy frost settling. The hum persisted, a constant, unsettling presence that amplified the isolation of the cove. The initial search efforts yielded nothing. The sonar showed the contours of the silt shelf, but no large anomalies. The state police divers conducted a methodical grid search, moving slowly across the bottom, trying not to disturb the fine sediment. They recovered pieces of our shared reel line, confirming the clean break I had observed. The line was cut, not broken by tension. This detail was logged meticulously in the official report. Days turned into a week. The search continued, expanding beyond the initial area. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the shoreline and the surrounding forest, but found no trace. The lake was systematically surveyed, every inch of the bottom mapped. My dive's temperature chart was analyzed. Dive slates were reviewed. Every piece of evidence was collected and filed. The hum was eventually attributed to a faulty ground loop, though it had never manifested. This explanation felt insufficient, a technicality that did not account for the unsettling feeling. The official report concluded with disappearance at sea, a standard designation for cases where no body or definitive cause is found. There was no evidence of foul play, no equipment malfunction other than the severed line. The clean cut remained an unexplained anomaly. The file was eventually closed, but the questions remained open for me. The cold, the dark, the silence after Mark's last transmission, These were etched into my memory. The official investigation concluded without a definitive answer. The state police report listed the cause as undetermined, citing the extreme conditions and the unique challenges of the deep quarry environment. My statement, along with the surface team's logbook entries and radio recordings, formed the core of the evidence. The severed reel line was noted as an unexplained factor. There was no body, no equipment, nothing to indicate what had happened to Mark. The lake held its secrets. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, the incident deemed an unavoidable tragedy. The experience left a permanent mark. I continued to dive, but the deep, cold water never felt the same. The isolation became more profound, the darkness more absolute. The hum on the radio, even when absent, seemed to linger in my memory. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear it. Not the actual hum, but the memory of it. A low, persistent static beneath the silence. I remember the cold, the absolute blackness of the silt shelf, and the moment Mark's light vanished. I remember the slack line and the clean cut. The forest around these lakes holds many secrets, and some of them remain submerged, undisturbed. I was working as a surface tender that night. It was late autumn, cold and dark, beside a quarry lake. The first oddity was the way the radio static seemed to hum with an unusual depth. Our team was conducting a night training dive, a routine exercise for advanced certification. The location was a deep quarry lake nestled in the Appalachian foothills, a place known for its clear upper waters and abrupt thermoclines. The air was still, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine from the surrounding forest. Headlights from our vehicles cast long, weak beams across the gravel parking area, barely penetrating the deep shadows under the ridge. The only sounds were the distant drone of insects and the quiet, measured breathing of the surface team. We were positioned on a small wooden dock, the water below us a flat, black expanse. The cold air bit at exposed skin, a sharp contrast to the relative warmth of the water below the surface. This isolation was typical for our training, fostering focus and reliance on procedure. Our routine for night dives was precise, almost ritualistic. Every piece of equipment was checked and rechecked. The primary diver, an experienced instructor, was already submerged, connected to me by a primary line and a full-face communication system. My role as tender was to monitor the line, track the diver's progress, and manage all communications through the surface comms box. A backup diver stood ready, fully geared, prepared for any contingency. The instructor, a man named Miller, was methodical and calm, his voice usually a steady presence on the primary channel. We had a dive plan, a depth log, and a temperature log, all meticulously maintained. The surface comms box recorded every transmission, a standard safety protocol. The night was clear, but the moon was hidden behind the ridge, leaving us dependent on our headlamps and the faint glow from the comms box display. The water temperature was barely above freezing at depth, a factor we always considered. The dive progressed without incident for about 20 minutes. Miller was exploring a section of the quarry wall, reporting his observations in a calm, even tone. I heard the faint drag of his line over the cleat as he moved. The comms box emitted its low, steady hum, punctuated by the occasional crackle of static. Then, Miller's voice came through, clear and unhurried. He requested slack on his primary line, indicating he needed more length to maneuver around an obstruction. I acknowledged his request immediately, my own voice calm and professional. I transmitted the instruction to provide slack, my hand already moving to release a measured amount of line. The moment my transmission ended, my own voice returned on the primary channel. It was my exact words, my precise intonation, echoing back. There was no delay, no distortion, just a perfect, chilling playback. I froze, my hands still on the line. The sound was not a feedback loop, nor was it a recording played back from the comms box. It was as if my own transmission had bounced off something in the water and returned instantly, perfectly replicated. The air around us felt sharper, colder. The quiet hum of the comms box seemed to intensify. I looked at the backup diver, whose eyes were wide, reflecting the faint light from the comms display. He had heard it too. The instructor, Miller, remained silent on the channel. He had not acknowledged the echo. I waited, my breath held, for some explanation, some crackle of static or a voice from Miller. Nothing came. Only the low hum of the equipment and the distant sounds of the forest. The echo had been so clear, so immediate, that it defied any logical explanation. It was not a typical radio anomaly. I had worked with these systems for years. I had never encountered anything like it. The backup diver shifted his weight, a quiet sound on the wooden dock. The cold seemed to seep deeper into my bones. I looked at the comms box, its display showing no incoming signal, only the steady green light indicating an open channel. The incident was brief, lasting only a few seconds, but the silence that followed stretched, heavy and profound. I found myself listening intently, not for Miller's voice, but for another echo, another impossible return. The quiet dread began to settle in. The instructor, Miller, eventually broke the silence. His voice was calm, asking if I had provided the requested slack. He sounded completely unaware of the echo. I confirmed that I had, my own voice feeling strangely hollow as I spoke. I did not mention the echo to him while he was submerged. It was critical to maintain his focus and avoid introducing any unnecessary stress during the dive. Once Miller surfaced, about 10 minutes later, the first thing I did was ask him if he had heard anything unusual on the comms. He reported a clear channel throughout, no anomalies, no strange sounds. He had heard my instruction to provide slack and nothing more. This detail deepened the unsettling nature of the event. Our lead instructor, a man named Davies, was on the surface. He was a veteran of many deep-water operations. I explained what had happened, describing the perfect, immediate echo of my own voice. The backup diver corroborated my account. Davies listened intently, his expression unreadable. He then initiated a full equipment check. We meticulously inspected the surface comms box, the primary line, the diver's full face mask, and the comms unit integrated within it. Every connection was verified, every battery level checked. We ran diagnostic tests on the comms box. Everything tested within normal operating parameters. There was no fault found, no loose wire, no malfunctioning component that could explain the phenomenon. The comms tape, which recorded all transmissions, was immediately pulled for review. We listened to the recording in the small, unheated cabin near the quarry entrance. The sound of my voice requesting slack was clear. Then, immediately following, was the distinct, undeniable playback of my own words. It was exactly as I remembered it. The recording confirmed the incident, but offered no explanation. Davies listened to it several times, his brow furrowed. He checked the recording for any signs of tampering or corruption. There were none. The sound was simply there, a perfect, impossible echo. The cold in the cabin felt more pronounced, a physical manifestation of the growing unease. The hum of the old fluorescent light above us seemed to vibrate with the same unsettling frequency as the radio static had earlier. The incident was documented in a formal report. Every detail was logged: the time, the depth of the diver, the equipment used, the environmental conditions. The comms tape was filed as evidence. The official conclusion was unexplained audio anomaly. There was no technical fault, no human error identified. The dive team was debriefed. The general consensus was a quiet bewilderment. No one had a plausible explanation. The quarry lake, usually a place of calm and routine, now felt different. The surrounding forest seemed to press in closer, its silence no longer comforting. The incident became a quiet whisper among the dive community, a story passed around with a sense of unease. The experience left a lasting impression. I continued my work as a tender, but my perception of the quiet hum of the radio, the static, and the deep, cold water had changed. I found myself listening more intently, always half expecting to hear something impossible again. The memory of my own voice, returned to me from the depths of that dark lake, still resonates. I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments. A perfect, chilling echo. I was on surface support, monitoring comms and gas, when the first anomaly occurred. It was late autumn, the air barely above freezing, and a thin fog hung over the Appalachian quarry lake. The initial report from our diver, Mark, contained a detail that did not quite fit the usual pre-dive checks. Our team was conducting a routine survey of the old CCC reservoir, a deep, cold body of water nestled between steep, forested ridges. Mark was our primary diver for these deep, low-visibility environments. He was equipped with a full-face comms mask, a primary line, and a dive slate for logging observations. The surface console displayed his depth, gas pressure, and elapsed time. The plan was to descend to a specific depth, locate a known submerged structure, a set of old stone steps, and follow them down, mapping their extent. This particular lake was notorious for its rapid thermoclines and the fine silt that could reduce visibility to zero in an instant. We had run similar operations many times before, always with meticulous preparation and strict adherence to protocol. The hum of the generator powering our equipment was a constant, reassuring presence in the quiet night. Mark began his descent into the dark water. The surface lights barely penetrated a few feet, quickly absorbed by the tannin-stained depths. His voice came through the comms, calm and steady, reporting his progress. He noted the increasing cold as he passed through the first thermocline, a sharp drop in temperature that always felt like entering a different world. The water was still clear enough for him to see the guideline extending into the blackness below. He reported reaching the first marker, then the second, his breath a steady rhythm in my ear. The lake was quiet, save for the distant, faint sound of highway traffic that sometimes carried across the water. He reached the target depth and confirmed visual contact with the stone steps. They were exactly where we expected them, a relic from the Civilian Conservation Corps era, now entirely submerged. Mark began his careful descent along them, reporting the texture of the stone under his fins. He described the steps as well preserved, almost perfectly uniform, disappearing into the deeper gloom. The comms remained clear, his reports precise. He was logging observations on his slate as he went, a standard procedure for these mapping dives. The depth plot on the console showed a steady, controlled descent, following the contours of the submerged structure. Then, a subtle shift in his voice. It was not alarm, but a slight change in cadence, a momentary hesitation. He reported a sudden drop in visibility, a common occurrence in these silt-heavy lakes. The comms developed a faint static, a low whisper beneath his words. I adjusted the squelch, but the background hum persisted. He continued his descent, reporting the steps were still present, but the surrounding water was now a complete blackout. He was relying entirely on his sense of touch and the guideline. The cold was becoming more intense, he noted, even through his dry suit. A few minutes later, the static intensified, making his voice sound distant, almost muffled. He reported reaching a significant depth, well past our initial target for the steps. I checked the depth plot. He was indeed deeper than planned, but still within his gas limits. I asked for a status update, reminding him of the revised depth limit. His response was delayed, then came through, fragmented. He mentioned the steps were still going down, but something else was present. He described a change in the stone, a different kind of construction, not the rough-hewn blocks we expected. He said the steps were now smoother, almost polished, and the gaps between them were too uniform. The comms then broke up completely for a few moments, just a burst of static and a low hum. When his voice returned, it was clearer, but the tone was different. It was still calm, but held a strange, almost detached quality. He reported that the steps had ended. He was at the bottom of the structure, he said. But then he added something that made me pause. He described a large, open space, not the expected silt-covered floor of the reservoir. He spoke of a vast chamber, cold and still, with an impossible echo. He said there were no steps leading out, only a smooth, dark wall. His final transmission was a single, drawn-out phrase, spoken with a quiet certainty. "It's not a lake down here." Then, silence. The comms went dead, leaving only the persistent static and the low hum of the surface equipment. My immediate response was to initiate emergency protocols. We had lost comms, and the last transmission was highly irregular. I called out to Mark, but received no reply. The depth plot showed his position holding steady, deeper than any previous dive in that section of the lake. We began the process of line retrieval, a slow and deliberate operation. The recovery diver was already suiting up, preparing for a deep, zero-visibility rescue. The air grew colder as the night deepened, and a thicker fog began to roll in from the forest, obscuring the distant highway lights. It took a little over an hour to bring Mark to the surface. He was unconscious, but still breathing, though his gas supply was critically low. We immediately began resuscitation efforts and prepared for transport. As we worked, I noticed his dive slate still clipped to his BCD. I unclipped it, hoping for a clear log of his final observations. The pencil was still secured, and there was a single, clear phrase written on the slate. It read, "Steps end at 180 feet, silt floor." The discrepancy was immediate and stark. His spoken transmission described a vast chamber, no silt, and a depth far greater than the one noted on the slate. The depth plot confirmed he had indeed gone deeper than 180 feet, holding steady at a depth closer to 250 feet when comms failed. We photographed the slate, secured the audio recording from the comms console, and began compiling our report. The local authorities were notified, and a formal investigation was initiated. The incident report detailed the comms failure, the diver's condition, and the conflicting information. The medical team worked on Mark, but his condition was critical. The hypothermia was severe, and he had suffered from extreme gas narcosis at that depth. The investigators reviewed our logbook entries, the equipment manifests, and the dive plan. They listened to the audio transcript repeatedly, focusing on the final transmission. The phrase, "It's not a lake down here," echoed in the small cabin where we conducted our initial debrief. The photograph of the slate was placed alongside the transcript. The contrast was undeniable. The official findings were inconclusive regarding the cause of the comms failure or the source of Mark's final report. They attributed his disorientation to severe narcosis and hypothermia, suggesting he had hallucinated the chamber and the smooth walls. The slate, they argued, represented his last coherent thought before the onset of extreme mental impairment. The lake bottom was surveyed again, but no such chamber was ever found. It was just a deep, silt-covered floor, exactly as the slate described. Mark never fully recovered. He suffered permanent neurological damage and could not recall the dive beyond the initial descent. The incident was filed away as a severe diving accident, a cautionary tale about the dangers of deep, cold water. But the audio recording remained, a piece of evidence that defied easy explanation. I still hear Mark's voice sometimes, calm and certain, describing that impossible space. The quiet dread of that final transmission, the words, "It's not a lake down here," still resonate in my memory. I was the comms operator for the night dive training exercise. The air was sharp, barely above freezing, as a thin fog began to settle over the forest lake. Our primary radio channel went dead without warning, a sudden, unsettling silence. We were positioned at the edge of an old quarry lake, deep within the Appalachian ridges. Headlights from the support vehicles cast long, distorted shadows across the gravel shore. The surface team huddled around the comms box, its green indicator lights the only real warmth in the encroaching night. The diver, a seasoned instructor named Miller, was already at depth, conducting a simulated recovery drill. His last transmission had been clear, reporting a descent through a thermocline. Then came the static, a brief burst of white noise, followed by an absolute void. We logged it as a complete radio failure, a known risk in these deep, cold coves. The backup system also remained silent. We initiated standard emergency protocols, preparing for a manual retrieval. The incident report was already forming in my mind, detailing equipment malfunction. We assumed the comms unit had simply failed, a common enough occurrence with older gear in these conditions. The recorder, however, continued its silent operation, capturing everything that followed. Our training site was a former mining quarry, now a deep, cold lake fed by mountain springs. These waters were notorious for their extreme thermoclines and near-zero visibility below a certain depth. We conducted regular night dives here, preparing divers for challenging conditions often found in cave systems or salvage operations. Every piece of equipment underwent rigorous checks before deployment. The comms box, a robust but aging unit, was always part of this routine. Its primary function was to maintain a constant audio link with the diver, allowing for real-time instruction and safety checks. A secondary recorder captured all transmissions, a non-negotiable part of our procedural logbook. This audio file served as evidence for debriefings and incident reports. The surface team consisted of 3 experienced personnel, each with specific roles. My role included monitoring the radio and ensuring the recording device functioned correctly. We understood the inherent risks of deep water, especially at night in these isolated forest locations. The cold was a constant factor, chilling the air and the equipment alike. The hum of the generator powering our lights and comms was a familiar, comforting sound against the vast silence of the surrounding forest. The next morning, under a pale, frosty sky, we began the post-incident review. The comms box had been retrieved and was undergoing diagnostics. My immediate task was to review the audio file from the recorder. I set up the playback unit in the small, temporary cabin we used as a command post. The air inside was still cold, despite a small space heater struggling against the chill. The recording began with the expected sounds, the faint hiss of the regulator, Miller's calm voice reporting his depth, the distant ripple of water as he adjusted his buoyancy. He described the silt layer he was navigating, the reduced visibility, and the cold bite of the water. Then came the static burst, exactly as we had heard it on the surface. After that, The channel went silent. I fast-forwarded through several minutes, expecting only dead air, a blank space confirming the radio failure. However, a faint rhythmic sound emerged from the silence. I rewound the tape, adjusting the playback speed and volume. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible against the background hum of the recording equipment. I leaned closer, straining to hear. The sound was a slow, deep intake of breath, followed by an even slower, deliberate exhale. It was not the sharp, mechanical hiss of a regulator. This was organic, resonant, and distinctly human. The rhythm was unnervingly steady, a long, drawn-out cycle of inhalation and exhalation. It sounded like someone sleeping, or perhaps in a deep meditative state. The faint click of Miller's regulator was still present, but it was overlaid by this other, deeper sound. The breathing itself seemed to fill the channel, pushing the regulator's noise into the background. I called over the lead instructor, a man named Davies, and the equipment specialist, Sarah. They listened intently, their faces growing still. We played the segment repeatedly, isolating the sound as much as possible. The breathing continued for what felt like an extended period, far longer than any diver would typically hold their breath, even with advanced techniques. It was a slow, deliberate process, each cycle lasting several seconds. The faint regulator click would sometimes coincide with an exhale, sometimes not. It was as if two distinct breathing patterns were present on the same channel, or one pattern was somehow amplified and distorted. The sound had a peculiar resonance, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the cabin. It felt heavy, almost oppressive. The depth log from Miller's dive console indicated he was at a significant depth when the comms failed, well past the first thermocline where the water temperature dropped dramatically. The recording continued for several more minutes after the breathing began. The sound remained consistent, unwavering in its slow, deep rhythm. There was no struggle, no gasp, no indication of distress. Just that steady, profound breathing. The background noise of the lake was completely absent during this segment. It was as if the microphone was focused solely on this one strange sound. The air in the cabin felt colder, despite the heater. We exchanged glances, a quiet understanding passing between us. Then, abruptly, the breathing stopped. The regulator click also ceased. The channel went completely dead. A final, absolute silence that was far more unsettling than the initial static. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the recording. We replayed the final moments, searching for any anomaly, any whisper of a sound. There was nothing. The recording simply ended, leaving a void. The silence that followed was heavy, a palpable absence of sound. We looked at each other, the cabin suddenly feeling much colder than before. The evidence was clear on the audio file, but its meaning remained elusive. The logbook for the dive would need careful amendment. The tent zipper from a nearby supply tent could be faintly heard in the background of the earlier parts of the recording. But even that small, familiar sound was swallowed by the later silence. The discovery initiated a full procedural review, far beyond a simple equipment malfunction report. We immediately isolated the audio file as critical evidence. Sarah, our equipment specialist, meticulously inspected Miller's comms unit and regulator. The comms unit showed no signs of external damage or internal shorting. Its battery levels were nominal. The regulator was functioning perfectly, delivering air as designed. There was no indication of a free flow or a blockage that might produce an unusual sound. We ran diagnostics on the surface comms box again, finding no faults. The recorder itself was also fully functional, its internal clock synchronized, its microphone calibrated. The surface team debrief was tense. Each member recounted their observations from the night before. No one had heard anything unusual on the surface comms after the initial static. Miller himself, after his successful manual ascent and decompression, reported no memory of anything beyond the comms failure. He recalled the sudden loss of contact, the immediate shift to emergency protocols, and his ascent. He remembered the cold, the silt, and the deep isolation of the quarry bottom. He had felt no unusual vibrations, heard no strange sounds through his helmet, and experienced no equipment anomalies. His dive computer logs confirmed a steady ascent profile. We considered every possibility. Could it have been an acoustic anomaly, a strange resonance within the deep water? The lake was known for its peculiar sound properties, but nothing like this had ever been recorded. Could it have been a malfunction of the recording device itself, a phantom signal? Sarah dismissed this, citing the recorder's recent calibration and its consistent performance on other dives. We even considered external interference, perhaps from a distant highway or an atmospheric condition, but the sound was too distinct, too organic. It was clearly a breathing pattern. The most unsettling aspect was the duration and consistency of the sound. It was not a brief, accidental noise. It was sustained, deliberate, and deeply rhythmic. The absence of Miller's own recollection only deepened the mystery. He was a highly experienced diver, acutely aware of his surroundings and equipment. For him to hear nothing while the recorder captured such a profound sound was inexplicable. We reviewed photographs taken during previous dives in the same area, looking for anything that might suggest an unusual geological feature or a hidden cavity. Nothing stood out. The deep water was simply a dark, cold void. The official report eventually cited an unexplained audio anomaly in conjunction with the comms failure. The incident was logged, the audio file archived, and the equipment declared fully operational. There was no logical explanation that fit all the facts. The silence that followed the breathing was also a point of contention. It was too abrupt, too complete. It suggested a finality that went beyond a simple equipment failure. The forest around the cabin remained quiet, but the quiet felt different now. It felt watchful. The cold seemed to seep deeper into our bones, a lingering chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. The incident closed without a definitive explanation. The dive team continued its training, but a subtle shift had occurred. The deep water of the quarry lake felt different, less like a training ground and more like a vast, unknowable presence. The audio file became a part of our confidential records, a piece of evidence that defied categorization. We never played it casually again. The hum of the radio, once a comforting background noise, now carried a faint undercurrent of apprehension. Every static burst, every momentary silence was scrutinized with a new intensity. The procedural logs were updated to include more stringent checks on all recording devices, but no amount of technical diligence could account for what we had heard. The isolation of the Appalachian forest, once a peaceful backdrop, now seemed to amplify the silence, making it feel heavy and expectant. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I still hear it. The slow, deep rhythm of that breathing, a sound that came from the absolute darkness of the lake. It was a sound that should not have been there, a presence captured on tape, existing beyond the reach of light or logic. The memory of that profound, deliberate exhale remains, a quiet dread that settles deep within the quiet hum of my own thoughts. It is a sound that reminds me of the vast, cold spaces that lie just beneath the surface, waiting. I was reviewing archived audio files from a cold case. It was a cold, wet afternoon in late autumn, the kind that settles deep into the bones. A subtle distortion on one particular tape caught my attention, a faint anomaly beneath the surface static. My office overlooked the valley, a winding ribbon of highway visible through the rain-streaked window. Below, the dark, still surface of Lake Hemlock reflected the gray sky, a constant reminder of the incident. My job involved sifting through the remnants of past investigations, searching for overlooked details in the quiet hum of old recordings. This specific file concerned a fatal dive operation from several months prior. The official report had been closed, attributing the diver's death to equipment malfunction and disorientation in extreme conditions. I had pulled the file as part of a routine audit, a procedural check of all archived materials. The tape deck, an older model with a reliable playback head, hummed softly on my desk. I put on my headphones, adjusting the volume, and pressed play. The initial playback offered nothing new, just the familiar crackle and the recorded voices of the surface team and the diver. The routine for these deep water recovery dives was always precise. Lake Hemlock, a former quarry now a CCC reservoir, was known for its extreme depths and sudden, dramatic thermoclines. Divers often encountered near-zero visibility below a certain point, a silt blackout that could disorient even the most experienced. The water temperature dropped sharply, becoming barely above freezing in the lower reaches. Communication was paramount, a lifeline through the dark, cold water. The dive team consisted of one primary diver, a safety diver on standby, and a surface support crew managing lines and communications. Their objective that day was to retrieve a small, submerged research drone, lost during a previous survey. The operation had been meticulously planned, with detailed dive slates and depth logs prepared beforehand. Every transmission, every breath, was recorded for post-dive analysis and safety review. I listened through the entire recording, a process I had completed many times before with other cases. The diver, a man named Miller, had been calm and professional throughout the initial descent. His reports were clear, detailing depth, temperature, and visibility as he progressed. The surface team's responses were equally steady, confirming his readings and providing guidance. Around 100 feet, Miller reported entering the thermocline, a sudden drop in water temperature. A few minutes later, he described the onset of the silt blackout, the complete loss of visual reference. His voice remained even, a testament to his training. He continued his descent, guided by his instruments and the surface team's instructions. The hum of his rebreather was a constant rhythmic presence in the audio. Then, the transmission changed. Miller reported reaching the target depth, about 200 feet. He confirmed visual contact with the drone, a small, dark shape in the beam of his dive light. His next transmission was brief, a single phrase confirming his position and readiness to begin the recovery. This was the last logged phrase in the dive report. The surface team acknowledged, and then, a few moments later, they called his name. There was no response. They called again, their voices growing more urgent. The recording continued for several minutes, filled with the surface team's increasingly frantic calls, interspersed with static and the sound of their own breathing. Eventually, the recording ended, a stark silence replacing the desperate calls. I paused the tape, the silence in my office suddenly heavy. The official explanation cited an abrupt equipment failure, possibly exacerbated by the extreme cold and pressure. Miller's body was recovered the next day, his rebreather showing signs of a critical malfunction. The investigation had been thorough, but the cause of the malfunction remained somewhat ambiguous. I rewound the tape to Miller's last transmission, the one confirming his position. I listened again, focusing intently on the brief pause after his last word. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper of something else. It was buried deep beneath the static, a ghost in the machine. I adjusted the equalizer settings on the tape deck, filtering out the higher frequencies, then the lower ones. I isolated the segment, looping it repeatedly. The sound was still there, a faint, breathy utterance. It was not part of the surface team's communication, nor was it the sound of Miller's rebreather. It was something else, something distinct. I slowed the playback speed, reducing it to half, then a quarter. The whisper became clearer, though still indistinct. It sounded like a single word, spoken very softly, almost a gasp. I leaned closer to the speakers, my headphones pressing against my ears. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the window pane, but I barely registered it. My focus was entirely on the faint sound, trying to pull it from the depths of the recording. I repeated the process, adjusting the filters, trying different playback speeds. The word began to coalesce, forming into something recognizable, something chilling. It was a name. Not Miller's name, or the name of anyone on the surface team. It was a different name, a woman's name, spoken with an inflection of surprise, almost recognition. The sound was so quiet, so buried, it was easy to understand why it had been missed during the initial review. It was not a shout, not a cry for help. It was a quiet, almost intimate utterance, as if Miller was speaking to someone directly in front of him. The implications settled over me like the cold lake water. Miller was alone in the dark, 200 feet down, in barely above freezing water. There should have been no one else there. The silence that followed the word was absolute, broken only by the increasing static as his communications failed. I removed my headphones, the sudden quiet of the office feeling unnatural. My chair creaked as I shifted, a small sound in the stillness. I reviewed the original dive log, the surface team's notes, and the investigation summary. There was no mention of any unusual sounds or communications beyond the logged phrases. The transcript markup only showed Miller's final, clear statement. I pulled up the lake chart, tracing the contours of the quarry, the known depths, the location of the drone. The area was isolated, far from any underwater structures or known hazards other than the depth itself. I printed a new transcript, marking the exact point of the anomaly. My next step was to bring in a colleague, a sound engineer with more advanced audio analysis equipment. I wanted an independent verification, a professional opinion. He was initially skeptical, accustomed to dealing with false positives and audio artifacts. We spent several hours in his lab, feeding the old tape into state-of-the-art digital converters, running it through sophisticated noise reduction software. The process was painstaking, a slow extraction of sound from silence. The engineer, a man named Davies, worked methodically, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. He isolated the segment, enhancing the frequencies, stripping away the hiss and hum. The word emerged, clearer now, undeniable. It was the same woman's name I had heard. Davies looked at me, his expression unreadable. He replayed the cleaned audio, looping the single word. It was distinct, a quiet, almost breathy sound. We listened to it dozens of times, trying to discern any other nuances, any other sounds. There were none. Just the name, then silence, then the increasing static. We cross-referenced the name with the dive team roster, with Miller's personal contacts, with any known associates. There was no one by that name connected to the operation or to Miller's immediate circle. The name itself was not uncommon, but its presence in that specific context was deeply unsettling. It was an anomaly that defied any logical explanation. The implications were profound. If Miller had spoken a name, a woman's name, in that moment of extreme isolation, who was he speaking to? And why was it not heard by the surface team? The surface team's equipment was robust, their monitoring protocols strict. The only explanation was that the sound was so faint, so brief, that it was simply lost in the ambient noise and the urgency of the situation. But the fact that it was there at all, a quiet whisper in the dark, cold water, changed everything. It added a layer of profound unease to an already tragic event. The official report, attributing the death to equipment failure, suddenly felt incomplete, hollow. We submitted a revised report, including the new audio evidence and Davies' analysis. The authorities reviewed it, acknowledging the discovery but offering no new conclusions. The word remained an unexplained anomaly. It did not change the official cause of death, nor did it provide any new leads for the investigation. It simply existed, a quiet, unsettling fact. The file was eventually re-archived, the new evidence appended to the original report. The lake remained, dark and cold, its depths holding its secrets. I still hear it sometimes, that quiet, breathy word. It surfaces in my mind during quiet moments, a ghost in the hum of the office. The sound of rain on the window, the distant traffic on the highway. They sometimes blend with the memory of that faint whisper. It is a reminder of the things that lie hidden, just beneath the surface, waiting to be heard.